All right, everybody, I want to welcome you to Theory Underground. I'm your host, David McCarricker, and what you're about to see is part 2 of a conversation that I had recently with Tony from One Dime over the Christmas break. What do I want to say about it? I think you'll enjoy it. You might be one of those kinds of people who's very confused, though. And there are more than a few who have presented themselves in the comment sections recently, especially with my post-duopoly video. The free side of that was provocative, to say the least. It at least got some people accusing me of both sidesism or of only punching left. And I thought I would address that real quick because there's a whole lot more of that in this video. And the reason for it is simple. There are 3 things. 1, radical responsibility. 2, radical responsibility. And 3, the left is the side that tries to claim me, even though I left it 5 years ago and have been in a serious period of moratorium, truth-seeking, inquiry, education, and Theory Underground is ultimately all about that. But why do I say radical responsibility 1 and radical responsibility 2? Well, it's simple. On the first side, it's like if you are a leftist, then you're a collectivist. You believe in large-scale structural change for the most people. It's supposed to be all good for the most people, right? Well, if you're trying to make decisions that impact the most people, then you're more responsible than your average person on the street or the person who's just trying to keep things the same. Full stop. You have a disproportionate share of responsibility if the decisions that you're trying to make or the position that you're trying to represent represents a lot of people or the most people. Okay, so that's first. That would mean that you're responsible for how you are perceived, for the messages that you're conveying, and for the predictable and inevitable forms of reaction that are being triggered by really stupid approaches to social change. So that's first. Second would be intellectual responsibility, intellectual radical responsibility. This is because if you are an intellectual, if you are college educated, if you are a theorist, if you really like to deconstruct and do socioanalysis or psychoanalysis or critical theory or the critique of political economy or any of these other things, then that puts you on the fringe. Most people are not like that. There's at least 8 billion people on the planet who are not doing the kinds of stuff that you're doing. And as a person who's getting into these big ideas, you have a disproportionate share of responsibility to not lord that over other people, to assume that they know what you know, right? But that is why I'm leading off here by saying all of this stuff, is because I also can fall into the trap of assuming you know what I know. And that conversation that I had recently with Tony called Radical Responsibility has yet to be published on One Dime Radio. It's coming out soon, but watching that would, I think, give you a much better understanding of what it is that I'm talking about here. It would help you understand one of the priors or the presuppositions that he and I are able to share. And because we share that as an assumption, we're able to have a pretty productive conversation. And I think we get pretty far thinking things through in a way that I am not always able to with other people who don't share those priors. And so I think that it's important to put these up front so that you understand and maybe are a little less confused when you're coming into this stuff, especially if you're coming in on Theory Underground from the left side of things. You might find out, like, what is going on here? Why is it that Dave seems so opposed to being lumped into the left at this point? And it is because I care more about truth-seeking and understanding the situation from a diverse array of perspectives that are not reducible to left or right. And I think that some of the greatest thinkers known to history really aren't reducible to either of these sides. But then some of my favorite people, they might be of the left or the right, but they don't allow that to stop them from thinking through other perspectives and engaging in dialogue with people with whom they have disagreements. And so that's the kind of environment that I try to cultivate here at Theory Underground. And I don't really think it's possible in a lot of mainstream institutions where you have to check these boxes for people where we all assume that we agree on 90% of the issues. I think that certainty is cringe. And I think that open-mindedness, truth-seeking, it's high IQ and it's based. Okay, so with all of that said, as a sort of disclaimer, I hope that you'll enjoy this video. If you find it interesting, I think you'll also be interested in my post-duopoly lecture that dropped recently. All right, enjoy. Like, comment, subscribe.
We cannot do direct revolution, but the only way to lay the foundation for it is to do what you are doing to move the underground. It's a theoretically correct title.
Welcome to Theory Underground, a place for workers with earbuds who are tired of letting others read and think on their behalf, slipstreaming our way into an understanding of a situation that short-circuits the deadlocks of our moment.
You're talking about this right side of the history, you know, a lot of leftists will say, okay, despite our problems, at least I'm on the right side. This is the central illusion, or I would say the central assumption holding the illusion of the left together. I always found it really peculiar that it's very common for people to believe that there is such thing as a leftist or leftism, but nobody on the right says I'm a rightist or I believe in rightism. There's all kind of ideologies, and left and right are really only useful as relational categories. They make sense when describing positions, not even full ideologies,
Right.
Positions relative to each other, and how, on what principles, on what axioms. Well, we take it to its origin, the French Revolution, you know, they always repeat this, yada, yada. It's really two things: equality and change over hierarchy and conservation or reaction. In the French Revolutionary context, when you think about it, that's a pretty damn different context, isn't it? You know, that's overthrowing a semi-feudal, overthrowing a basically feudal order. And that is political change and of society moving towards more equality. Those things sound great. I lean more on equality than I do on inequality. I'm not a full communist, equality of outcome, but I am much further on the line of equality than I would be to like someone, Jordan Peterson, who thinks just because inequality is natural means that you can't deal with the inequalities of capitalism, right? He'll kind of give this sort of justification for hierarchies that exist. So will most free market economics people, they'll say, well, rich people are just, you know, getting rewarded for the value that they contribute, and that's how they see it, right? I don't believe in that. This question of change is where I think it's really interesting. Because in a capitalist society, you know, which really only emerges proper capitalism emerges, you know, largely when the word itself becomes a thing. Capitalismus, as in the Industrial Revolution. You know, there's debates as to when capitalism began exactly, but really capitalism as we know it begins in the Industrial Revolution. And Marx is writing in this time. And what does he characterize capitalism as? A system of constant change. Acceleration of change. All that solid melts into air. The bourgeoisie are constantly revolutionizing the modes of production. All that, you know, it's a progressive system, and he saw it as progressive, but he saw it as progressing into some new freedom. It was pregnant with this communist revolution that could lead to communism, and that's how he built his history, his theory of the primitive communism to slave society to antiquity feudalism, then to capitalism, then to low phase communism / socialism, to this advanced communism, which was to be a society that used the productive fruits of capitalism, like, you know, technology and all that, and big corporations and the power that they provide to build a society of abundance. But it's like, well, look at what we actually got. Marx was right about capitalism. I think he's wrong about communism. And he was right about capitalism in the sense that it's so progressive in a way that we actually kind of forget. We forget that progressivism was created as an ideology to manage the workers' movement, as you've written about too, with discursive Taylorism. Progressivism emerged as an ideology to manage workers' movement, comes out of the managerial revolution, and it wants to soften the edges of it. We've somehow misconstrued progressivism as a leftist ideology. And maybe it is, because maybe that's what the left means now. But then that means something very different than a post-capitalist goal, or a goal that conflicts with capitalism. And conflicts with is not the same as accommodates, right? There's a lot of people on the left who support policies, some of which might conflict with capitalism, like, for example, redistribution of wealth or socialized medicine, Medicare for all. That does contradict with capital in a very obvious way. Then there's some left-wing policies that might seem socialistic, but that actually accommodate capitalism, like childcare. Let's have people work more, not work less. Let's have the government, take care of the children for longer so that the parents can work more. Right? That's an accommodationist policy. It's not really breaking from capitalist logic. It might make people's lives better. And that's the defense of it. Makes people's lives better. Okay.
Yeah, let's just turn families into roommates, like glorified roommate situations. Great idea.
But once I made this observation, okay, like, when we think about the left is on the right side of history. Well, obviously, I mean, it depends on who you ask, but I think it was in the French Revolution. French Revolution didn't go that well, but in terms of like overthrowing the monarchy, there was many groups that agreed on that, many factions. Most agreed that it was, the monarchy was shit. There's a lot of people agree on change, and they might be for a more equal society. In a society, though, in an socioeconomic context where change is the norm, progressive ideology that's bent on change is not something that challenges that order, but that rationalizes it, and in fact, sugarcoats it. In fact, what it does is it will rationalize things that are either already happening and say that they're good. And in practice, some of those things might be good, and some of those things might be decay that progressivism tries to paint as progress. Like, for example, decline of family, of stable households, of having parents that are, together and not absentee all the time. That is celebrated as women's liberation, right? Or more women in the workforce. You could look at the decline of standards that emerges and the rise of STIs, and also there's a lot of rise of rape and sexual assault. No one wants to talk about that the sexual revolution actually unleashed a lot of that under college campuses. A big percentage of, SA happens in college campuses and parties when people are drinking, engaging in casual sex, right. Not in, marriages. Like that's an important thing. People don't talk about that.
Yeah, the sexual revolution's contradiction is Me Too. Like this is the whole thesis of Louise Perry's The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, right? It's like and this should be, it is a great book, but this should be an obvious go-to, an easy go-to, something that, but of course it's like touching something very sensitive. It's very complicated to address it. So I think she does a really good job. I think Louise Perry is like a fantastic sort of representative of this kind of critical feminist kind of approach that says, look, yeah, there's some good things, but let's stop acting like Hugh Hefner and Marilyn Monroe equally benefited from the sexual revolution, and that ever since then, women have been getting steamrolled, chewed up and spat out by capital, and all the protections that were in place, which maybe we don't like the way those protections were articulated, or maybe some of them didn't really fit. The fact is that there were protections in place, limits in place that made it so that women don't have to constantly negotiate for themselves and constantly draw their own boundaries. Because she even talks about how, like, the very idea of modesty, or of, like, no, you don't just, you don't hook up with somebody on the first date. Those kinds of norms made it so a woman doesn't have to reject a guy, right? It made it easier to be around guys instead of having to fight them off or go along with them. And obviously all of the kinds of problems from that.
Yeah, it was considered very, like you weren't supposed to, as a man, go and just like flirt with every woman. And you certainly weren't supposed to, you weren't even, this is the thing, there's the kind of non-premarital sex thing, which is, that is, just because one can say that is less important after the invention of contraception doesn't mean that you just have no norms and that there is no limits. Because, this is the body count discourse. Some people say, oh, I don't care about body count. Why should you care about it? Everyone cares about it in practice. And that's what the Bonnie Blue dilemma kind of reveals, is everyone has a limit. You know what I mean? Nobody is
Right,
cool with this
right.
stuff. Nobody not. And if you look at the zeitgeist when it comes to like what, you know, I pay a lot of attention to what my female friends say and like kind of what the media they consume and kind of what like people I know who are kind of got like, you know, wrapped into manosphere stuff. And what you see is actually an emergence of sexual puritanism on both sides, but it's like very resentment filled and confused and without solutions that blames the other sex rather than looking at the kind of broader problem, which is the, you know, social collapse. And look, this is the consequence of tearing down fences before asking why they were there, instead of maybe fixing the fence a little bit, you know, tearing it down. And that's, but what I would also say is it would be a mistake to say that, you know, second wave feminism is solely to blame for like destroying all this, because really what it was just rationalizing and accommodating as an ideology what was happening with capitalism. Capitalism was transforming into a consumer economy, and a consumer economy doesn't mesh very well with an ideology that, you know, tells you to be austere, to save money, to have a strong work ethic, and to feel shame and guilt if you're too hedonistic. No, it wants the exact opposite. It wants you to keep the work ethic, but for yourself, for your best life, to enjoy as much as possible. So then you get a twofold ideological superstructure of the kind of Reaganism, which is conservative, but in what sense, really? You know, it's like it places everything on the individual. It's, oh, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, yada yada. It's the ideology of the workaholic. But on the left, you get this kind of like ideology that's, I mean, I think it's perfectly articulated by one of the books that came out in this whole period. It was what's it called? It was Against Nature or something like that. It was even Marcuse critiqued her. God, what was it called? She's like Wilhelm Reich type. Wilhelm Reich's another figure like this, but I'll remember when I have it. I mentioned it in the piece.
Yeah, you do?
Yes.
You do reference it in the piece? Okay, because I could do a quick word search if you want me to find. Let's see. You say Against Nature? Would that bring it up?
Or Life Against Death. Norman
it
L. Brown, Life Against Death.
There we go.
Which is, you know, life should all be all about play. So, you know, she thinks like duty, honor, order, that's all like kind of outdated and oppressed. What we should do is we should make it about play and fun. And you get this kind of, this is a superstructure. And really these ideas aren't so much like, it's not like everyone's reading them and becoming influenced. These ideas just reflect what is already happening and rationalize it, which is, you know, as Christopher Lasch called it, the permanent infantilization of people, which is like, you know, the capitalist system wants us to be like childish consumers, essentially, you know?
Right. And like, so you said figures like Norman O. Brown in the 1960s advocated for organizing society around pleasure and self-expression rather than guilt, duty, and moral constraint. I just want to say that, you know, so it's, you know, a woman, but really this is also coming from Wilhelm Reich. It's coming from a lot of the, like these men who had
Marcuse
basically harems of women in the 60s. And one of the things about this is that it is, once you hear it and once you see this, you'll never unsee or unhear it. It is the subtext of how the nice guy gets in a girl's pants. It's, oh, hey, it's freedom. Oh, it's about pleasure. Ooh, self-expression, baby. Oh, yeah. Oh, no guilt here. And it's just kind of like, it's just like schmoozing your way into people's pants. Like that is what it comes off as once you kind of realize it's, I mean, I can't even hear people like Terrence McKenna or Alan Watts. Like, but basically it's like the 1960s hippie thing. There's like little aspects of things that are really interesting there, but it's infused with this, like, it's like, I'm just trying to get in your pants. It's like the ideology of just like, hey, just take your top off, babe.
Yeah, why are you so repressed? This was a real thing. Yeah. This was a real phenomenon. I mean, it's funny because my mom is like technically, you know, you could say a late boomer. So kind of grew up in punk, but was a kid during the hippie stuff. And just like hearing, like she would say that like a common complaint. She was like, oh, we all knew it. Like this was like the sexual revolution. Do you ever have like an adult in your life who just says things in a matter of fact way? They don't have proof, but they just like know
Not
it's
a lot
true.
of them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because she just says all the time, she's like, "Oh yeah, we all knew it. Yeah, sexual liberation was created by men." No,
Right.
it was just
Right.
a total way to just be like, yeah, be less repressed. You have access to this, whatever. And of course, I'm sure it appealed to some women, and a lot have been programmed to think, this is liberation, this is empowerment by, objectifying yourself and all that and whatever. And you have like what I would just say is, it's common for people to complain about fuck boys, right? Or like playboys, but you have like, okay, Nicki Minaj is like the female equivalent of that. Like, oh, I'm popping my pussy, and it's like bragging about the sort of stuff. It's like unapologetic. I mean, at the end of the day, it's like I think both sexes need to admit like they fucking hate this shit. Women complain about fuck boys. They complain about situationships, which is just a code word for an unequal transaction. One person wants sex, other person wants relationship. That's all it is.
Right.
Because if you wanted
Right.
the same thing, there wouldn't be a situationship, it would be a relationship. It wouldn't be ambiguous.
Yeah.
So it's like there's these discontinuities because what we've done is we've marketized the sexual realm, and there was this free love fantasy, which says that like if you remove the restrictions, you would have had people freely choose based on what they freely desire. But what they don't realize is that that's shaped by the market. And the real pill, which the communists don't accept, even people like Christian Gazne, who will admit that the sexual liberation lowered the price of sex and therefore actually kind of very much damaged women in this way. It was not good for their interest. Christian Gazne, who's like a Marxist feminist, she wrote the book Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism. There's still this like implicit assumption that like under a communist world there can be real free love. She tends to underplay it the extent of the reason why the actually existing socialist regimes were a little bit better on the sexual question than they were, is because they're actually very culturally conservative, very much so. She even admits that, partially due to their Orthodox heritage, in the Eastern Europe. But there's a still fantasy among some communists that, okay, well, if you just get rid of the commercial, the capitalism, but okay, what is the market? The market is just a constellation of buyers and sellers, of individuals. The problem with the market is that it gives us what we want, but it doesn't give us what we need, or at least not all the time. And what we want is sometimes stupid and sometimes very at odds with what we need. And for example, many people might need and want connection, but we might in the short term just want short-term gratification. We might just be attracted to beauty. It's a very, very easy thing to be enchanted by in the short term, or to scarcity. That's a big thing. The market operates on scarcity. It's why this is a known phenomenon in the dating world. Everyone knows it, which is, playing harder to get or whatever. It makes you more desirable. Oh, suddenly a girl sees you with other girls, they now all are interested in you, right? Where it's like, whereas if you're, give too much attention, these are all like market dynamics. And that's the problem, the marketization of it. And what justifies the marketization of sexuality more? Left-wing ideology or right-wing ideology? At this stage, or at least conservative ideology, left-wing ideology, liberal left-wing ideology. And that's where we need to rethink this left side of history. Well, yeah, you might be on the right side of history when your change is overthrowing an oppressive monarchy. It might be when it comes to tackling an oligarchy, but change isn't always good. Change happens under capitalism. And what if your ideology of change, progressivism, in fact, reinforces that capitalistic process? What if it helps it? What if it unleashes it? Many have written on this. This is Daniel Bell, The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism. It very much, capitalism was unleashed. I would say the 60s should be viewed as the Great Acceleration.
The
so many things that weren't
acceleration into specifically cultural consumer capital, right? Like it's that shift into finance capital, into consumer capital, into the idea that you don't have a life outside of work except through how you curate your identity through consumption.
And it goes back, the first people to be against advertising were Christians. Most vehemently opposed to advertising were Christians. Very opposed to it in America. You know,
Well, that'd be cool.
yeah. So it's like, well, that's an example right there where religion is not, as some Marxists have concocted in their head, like some bourgeois ideology used to keep the class structure and brainwash the masses from not actualizing their interests. It's like, in many ways, it's actually also a limit on capital. And there's also another dark history we can get into. There's a whole bunch of pills when it comes to communism, when it comes to like Wall Street actually being the first people to, pay out to buy up the debt of the government the Bolsheviks inherited, and that America wasn't opposed to the Russian Revolution, actually supported it up until the Bolsheviks started to export revolution, which is when you got imperialist encirclement. But that's a whole pill. No one wants to go there. That's where you get into dark stuff where unfortunately the Nazis take this to really crazy conspiracy. That's the thing where I think what the piece I wrote will make some Marxists nervous, because they'll be like, this sounds fashy, even though I'm very explicitly democratic and very, post-racial. But like, the thing about it is it's rare to see these sort of like conservative coded critiques of capitalism and communism, because unfortunately, one of the people who tried to create a synthesis that was socialist and anti-communist were what was called the third position, and fascism comes out of third position. And that's the problem about that, though. It's like, I don't know, I don't feel like I need clarification as to why I don't identify with the third position, because the tendencies in the third position were all also anti-democratic. They thought capitalism and democracy, liberalism were all inherently tied together, so you must oppose all of them. And that's why they all supported dictatorship. And the socialism they believed in was statist, like ultra-statist. And as I define in my work, I see socialism is the distribution of economic power in the way that democracy is the distribution of political power. And that it's a kind of spectrum, And sure, there's other definitions of socialism, but if socialism is just more government ownership, that doesn't mean anything. You can have a more oppressive society with more government ownership. Look at corruption in the Soviet Union. Nixon had the story of how Brezhnev, it's an allegation, but we don't know if it's true, but supposedly Brezhnev in a meeting with Nixon pointed at a bunch of Russian supermodels and said, which one do you want? I can give you whoever.
Oh my God.
And there's a lot of that kind of corruption in the Soviet Union. It was known that their kids and them would get access to Western goods and diamonds and all kind of stuff, while their public had to go to the gray market to buy Beatles albums. It's like, tell me that's socialism. If that's socialism, I think I prefer what I have here. Thanks.
Right. Yeah. Socialism also became being told where you were going to work, how long you had to work, right? And so it actually, if what we're going off of is that style of socialism, then I can say, yeah, no, I would prefer the laissez-faire market approach, where at least I can choose where I work, or to try to like do something on my own. There is some relative freedom in that, even though, of course, I have that position where I am critical of the idea of being free to market forces, because obviously you're still being measured up against socially necessary labor time. And then if you have your own business, you're just exploiting yourself for surplus value. And so your freedom is like the freedom of being homeless, essentially. But also it got to such an absurd point in Soviet society that actually freedom to be homeless was a freedom. Like, to be a beatnik in America, I would rather that than to be like decently well off in Soviet society, because you could bum around America and kind of do whatever the hell you wanted. It's still shitty, but I'll take it. And so on the one side, it's this being freed to the market forces. On the other side, it's being freed to your libidinal forces. And so the horseshoe theory here is the limitlessness of those two sides. And if you're the kind of person like me who's able to make the most of that and, relatively do all right in that situation, the point is that most people don't. That's Louise Perry's whole point with the case against the sexual revolution. It's even if it's working out for you because you're like a charismatic guy, it's not working out for most people, right? And so, you know, is what you're doing rationalizing the way that things currently are, or is what you're doing actually trying to do a kind of theory that understands the problems of the situation and how things could be better at scale, right? And on the point about cultural conservatism and how people hear a little bit of cultural conservatism and just go, oh my God, it's fashy. I think part of the reason is also just because they're so stuck in a very particular interpretation of 20th century history, right? I forget what the name of that book is about anti-fascism, right? The legacy of an idea.
Paul Gottfried.
Paul Gottfried, yeah. Yeah, they've kind of got this everything is Hitler sort of interpretation of, you know, there's basically two paths forward. One is this one of progress. The other one is this one of barbarism that will look like Hitler. And what they're missing is the idea that, well, there also just might be certain timeless human, if not values, timeless, if not norms, something like this tends to work for a lot of people. I mean, in fact, maybe most people. And if it's not 100% timeless, it works at scale. So for instance, you might say, well, some people have a great life and they live very tribalistically as peasants or in more hunter-gatherer type societies. And then what you'll get, especially with like these decolonized love people that we like to, you know, talk about or whatever, like, you know, they're
doing Dave, they're doing equally as good as work as us.
I know. They're trying to take something that might arguably work in a village with 150 people. You know, it's under Dunbar's number.
When it's like the man who fucking has all the wives. That's the only actually existing polyamory is just like fucking sultanism.
Yeah. It's polygamy, exactly.
Yeah, polygamy,
but
which was banned, by the way, even by the communist states. Which the respect to the Chinese commies for that.
And I don't think it was banned because these people end up being obnoxious, but they also, it'll probably get in America, it'll probably get banned just because they're obnoxious, right? Like like that video I saw them do recently. That's like a skit of
like they didn't ban. Sorry, I should clarify because they're going to say, "Oh, you're trying to ban No, they banned polygamy in China."
Right.
Just to clarify.
Right.
I don't think polyamory is something anyone thought of because who the fuck has the free time for that shit?
Right. No, you would have to be extremely time energetically privileged. And the thing about time energy privilege is that you can't see it until you've read my book. And so, of course, you know, the decolonized love people are just like, they just can't see what they're taking for granted. But what I'm trying to say, though, is like basic kinds of conservatism. It gets interpreted as fascism by a very black or white kind of thinking. And this is part of the reason why I'm doing the most boring thing in the world at Theory Underground, maybe to some people, yet some people are going to think it's like the most fascist thing ever. And to me, it's just very exciting to be doing it because I've kind of wanted to do this for a long time. And I actually just sent you the link here. You got it in your email, but it's just the philosophy of stewardship in household economics, also referred to as based adulting 101. But basically this is why I said it's like boring. It's not self-help. It's not self-care. It's deep roots in the canon kind of approach to being mindful and deliberate about your form of life and how you live with other people. And you know, when I say deep roots, I mean like we're going all the way back to Xenophon and his home economics, right? And of course, Leo Strauss wrote this whole book about Xenophon's economics, or some people will pronounce it as oikonomics because it's the Greek and it usually goes untranslated, but it just means home economics. And kind of the idea here is that this stuff gets kind of coded as conservative. And if anybody looks at the bibliography, they might think that because it actually has a sort of gendered division in the bibliography. There's actually a section down here. I'm just going to read it. Ethics, etiquette, and conduct for men. And then there's another section, etiquette, politeness, and conduct for women. And I'll read off a couple of these titles because they're funny. But I just want to say before I read that, you should take a look at this. You pull it up. But these first of all, these titles are not taught. Nobody knows about these anymore. And to me, I think this is part of the issue with the idea of freeing up strict gender roles. For me, I do the dishes in my family. You know what I mean? I do probably 80% of the dishes, and my wife does like 80% of the cooking, right? And I think that that's kind of normal for nowadays. Everybody's busy, and we're all trying to fill in for one another's lacks. And, you know, we take turns helping on the laundry. And my wife hates Michael Knowles for saying that, you know, he's like very proud that he's never touched and doesn't even know how to work his washing machine. You know, it's just like, that's man-child shit now, guy. Grow the fuck up, right? But that kind of gendered specialization, you know, obviously it's easy to resent it, and it's easy to see how we are transcending it. But also there's a whole world beyond cooking, cleaning, and going to work as these sort of traditionally gendered things. There's a whole world beyond that stuff of skills that used to be taught to men and women. And we have been de-skilled as a human civilization from those things that were just part of being a competent adult. And so in the ethics, etiquette, and conduct for men, for instance, obviously I've got Aristotle's Nicomachean and ethics, but I've also got stuff like Seneca on anger, mercy, and revenge. I can't tell you how much I wish I had read that as a 12-year-old or even younger. But like his philosophy of anger and how stupid anger actually makes you look and everything. It's not like a Christian approach to forgiveness and acceptance and all this stuff. It's a Roman, like hardcore kind of guy. Like anger is stupid for all of these reasons. And so it's very reason-based. And it's the kind of thing that you actually need as a young man who's especially going through puberty, right? Especially if you're like a blue collar kind of guy, where a sort of like brazen sort of, I don't know, front that you put out is like part of survival. You need this, because otherwise the alternative is just this sort of soft PMC boy thing, right? And it's just not going to work. But I'll just read a couple of these other titles. The English Gentleman from 1630 by Richard Brathwaite. Or down here, we've got The Women of England from 1839 by Sarah Stickney Ellis. There's a whole bunch of other sort of categories from the bibliography that have nothing to do with like these gendered forms of etiquette, such as household management and domestic economy, contemporary critiques of family and society, stewardship. There's a giant section on stewardship, and then lifelong learning in the classics. But basically what I'm getting at is, for some people, this is fascism. And what I'm trying to say is that if you want to be beyond all of that, or if you want to find a way of kind of transcending the mutually exclusive dichotomy between these two sides of femininity and masculinity, you at least have to know what that used to mean when people still knew how to be competent adults.
Okay. So you had a whole dimension, the stewardship stuff. I know I would love to look into that, the reading list that you have there. Absolutely. Like that's very interesting. It adds a whole dimension. When it comes to the fascism thing, you know, one thing I'll say, there's, I think, two reasons why, well, I mean, there's obviously more than that, but like two big reasons that I've identified as to why some people on the left are quick to call anything like this fascy. And one of it's reflexive, one of it is kind of, well, also reflexive, but also disingenuous. So the first one is the disingenuous aspect. And that is, so there's when it comes to leftists who think everything's fashy, there's usually one of them is either an ultra progressive type or the other is a Bolshevik type. They're driven by different priorities. Both end up being shock troops for capitalism, though, but the Bolshevik type unintentionally so, but the progressive intentionally so, actually.
Okay.
This progressive capitalism. with the Bolshevik type, okay, the reason why they're so quick to call everything fascist is because in reality, the political tendency that is the closest to fascism is their tendency. You think about what is bad. What was bad about fascism? Was it that it was socialistic and conservative, or that it was a dictatorship that killed millions of people? Oh, you know what? Also, the dictatorship that killed millions of people, Bolshevism. Sure, for different reasons, but they did that. They both believe in a total state, and the other thing is, you know,
the one side killed anyone who could be perceived as a rich person. The other side said rich people are Jews. That's the difference.
Well, yeah, in practice, they both killed whoever opposed them, right? And whoever opposed the regimes. Fascism,
Right.
I call it the twin of Bolshevism in many ways. If you look at its emergence, it's very much tied to that. It's tied to the attempts to export communism. They really, like, Bolshevik types like to accuse people who are social democratic oriented as being fascistic because they accuse them both of class collaborationism. In reality, what it is because it's a game theory thing. So like ideas like social democracy rival Bolshevik ideas. And, you know, if you had social democracy, it would take away the imperative for Bolshevik revolution. So they see it as like a rival and they want to demonize it, and they love to lump in social democracy with that. So there's that element. Even though it doesn't matter if, like, you know, one's conception of socialism is just completely different from a statist version. Now there's the ultra progressive one, which I would say is a more common reflex, and it's in a lot of leftists. And this is that they're more of their ideology is more defined by being against the right, and hates conservatism more than they like socialism or like equality or just like people, for that matter. Often a lot of these people really don't like people, you'll find. They really don't. And this is how you know someone's a shock trooper for capitalism, and it's often unintentionally so, but they are intentionally malicious they are intentionally dishonest, even if they're not intentionally shock troops for capitalism. They are intentionally dishonest in how they will accuse anything conservative of being fascistic. For one, fascism was explicitly anti-conservative. It might have been right-wing in the sense as reactionary, but it saw itself as a revolutionary ideology that didn't want to, that was often really suspect of religion. It liked some things in religion. It did like traditional gender roles. Often it detested communism for its kind of bohemian globalism and all that stuff. It detested that. But if you look at what fascism tried to do, very explicitly so, was to replace the function of things like the church or religion and civil society with the state. Mussolini, that was the purpose. With Hitler, that was the purpose. They both ended up, you know, conflicting pretty heavily with religion. In fact, Hitler, he said he wished. Okay, I don't want to throw shade at my Muslim friends. You know, I have respect for Islam, but like, you know, Hitler had this quote where he said, "I wish Germany was a Muslim country and not a Christian." Because he thought Christianity teaches these, you know, very like weak virtues that, you know, that believe in equality and, you know, protecting the weak. And he had this very hierarchical view.
This is why Tucker Carlson says nice things about Islam, like almost every time it comes up, because he does like those aspects of it right there, right?
Now, I will say Islam is, you know, because the problem is Islam, there's many types of Islam. It's like there's types of Christianity. There is, but if you're talking about political Islam, that is a true kind of statement. And there is a whole other dimension of Islam in which it's kind of actually very feminist, you know, in a lot of, for its time and also in its teaching. So I don't want to, you know, denigrate a whole tradition with that. I generally like to respect traditions for its good and bad tendencies that evolve out of it. But, you know, it's also, you know, what I mean here is that Hitler's point when he said that was he wished Germany was more governable, and he didn't like that there were obstacles to the state being able to govern people, which one of those things was religion. You know, you follow your family first, you follow your religion. The state is like secondary, you know? What I like to say to my Marxist internationalist friends who believe in fantasies of international revolution, workers of the world unite, is the real critique of nationalism is not that's, in favor of some like globalist fantasy that never happens, but it's rather that actually nationalism is usually not that significant in most people's lives. It can be a substitute. It can help. What I would say is nationalism, insofar as it's ever good, it's only when it binds very diverse groups together, like religions, people of different races, etc. Most people in their day-to-day life, though, they're maybe that's different now. We're in a very different age, but at least in the time where fascism takes power, the church is still present. People practice their religion. They have a nuclear family. And they want total control. They see the church as a liability. They see unions as a liability, anything that's an independent association. Fascism was explicitly anti-conservative, and it was driven by the youth. You can really judge political movement by who its early proponents are. This is going to sound like such a fucking false equivocation. It is. I'm not trying to equivocate them. But like early fascist groups looked like Antifa people. They were going up, beating people up, causing mayhem, and it was mostly young people. It was called the Hitler Youth, and the early black shirts with Mussolini were mostly young people who'd go up, beat up trade unionists, communists, or people who caused who they saw as rivals to them. And the ruling elite didn't like them either. They thought they were too radical, but they eventually saw them as like preferable. Because at least they contained the workers, at least they contained the unions. So they kind of like enabled them, empowered them. It's why the Freikorps were allowed even under Weimar Germany, because they would do that. But like, look, so it's not fascism is being conservative. Forget that shit. This is stupid. When we talk about conservative, we're talking about traditionalism, which is stuff that transcends politics. It transcends any political. You can have all kind of ideas cross over with tradition. In the sense that tradition is in civil society. It's what people inherit from ancestors. It's stuff that's tried and true that people have practiced for a long time. And when we're making this critique, it sounds conservative, but what's wrong with that? People always like to say, "Oh, that's conservative." Why is that bad? You ever thought about that? Like, why is that bad? What makes it? Oh, because it's right wing. Why is that bad? What's right wing? Oh, because it's fascist. Okay, well then, yeah, it's not. So what do you have there? And I think this insistence on demonizing anything conservative, what it ends up doing is it's a very powerful force in being a shock troop for capitalism, because you end up really actually in practice opposing the working class.
All right, everybody, I want to make a quick shout out to the patrons over at Patreon who make the free content possible here at Theory Underground, and also say thank you to my TU membership. All of you amazing members at Theory Underground, you make this possible for me to do as a way of life. In thinking about our way of life, though, I have rolled out a very special series for 2026. Outside of the Philosophy of Stewardship and Home Economics seminar that is all year long, which is also very amazing. Outside of Intro to Theory, which I'm really excited about teaching, and we have so many amazing guests from Simon Critchley to Nick Land. And outside of the Philosophy of Religion being taught by Samuel Wankar, which I'm really stoked about, there is a practical element, and the practicum that I'm doing through McCarricker Family Farm and helping you think about how to plant and grow things or build houses and whatnot. Outside of all of that, there's also just writing as a practical activity. Writing because you have things that you need to say, and you need to just get over the neurotic, pedantic, stultifying business norms and academic quibbling that keeps you from moving on and transforming as a process of writing. So writing should be transformative. If you want to rewild yourself to some extent and have fun writing and learn how to focus on the substance over the style, at least for a little while, because you can always go back to the other approach later, well then reclaim writing, reclaim writing. That's what I've got up on the screen here. And it's a part of the theory writing workshop that I'm leading throughout the year of 2026. It takes place on the second Monday of every month. The first one's coming up here really soon. You'll be able to watch the backlog of videos if you're joining late. And I think it will help you think about writing in a whole new way. So if you're not just a standard word cell, if you aren't into that kind of writing, or if you are, either way, I think that you'll get a lot out of this because it's going to help free you up into new ways of expressing yourself and then doing it for the sake of transformation. So yeah, if that sounds interesting, then you'll want to sign up at tier 2 or higher at Theory Underground, http://theoryunderground/subscribe. That's where you'll go. That's where you'll find it. Become a subscriber today. I'd love to see you at the workshop. Thank you.
So they end up actually opposing the common majority, who is tied to a lot of that stuff and a lot of very different traditions and stuff that might seem conservative to the PMC cultured cosmopolitan mind. They end up actually opposing that and end up actually rationalizing what capitalism is already doing, which is eroding tradition and accelerating to a transhumanist future. And so they end up being shock troopers for capitalism. And you know how to identify a shock trooper for capitalism? This is, so I'm just going to give this guideline. You know, they say, a guide to find a fascist, guide to find a shock trooper for capitalism, because they exist, they're in the system. Some of them have attacked me. So I want the listeners to be able to identify exactly what I'm talking about. If a person is more obsessed with going after right-wing deviations and things that they oppose as right-wing than they are advancing socialism and confronting the reality that is necessary for socialism to happen, which is the people it's supposed to be for, which is the working majority, then you know that their priority is being an anti-rightist, which in practice means being a shock trooper for capitalism. And they'll say progressive capitalism. Catrone makes this point a lot, which is that, you know, it's progressive capitalism. But I would just say progressive capitalism is just a wing of capital, and in some ways, the more powerful wing of it. Because if you look at the difference between right and left-wing parties, they both help capitalism, but the right-wing parties pretend to not be, like, they'll acknowledge problems, like, for example, like immigration, and they'll say they're doing stuff about it, so that's why they will terrorize Home Depots and have, you know, make a big fuss out of that. But they'll extend the visas. And in fact, it was the right-wing parties like in Thatcher, Reagan, then Clinton and Blair who expanded the visa programs that allowed for more mass immigration because that was good for a cheap workforce, an efficient workforce. The right will at least pretend to be standing for the worker and appeal to their interests, which is why you have right-wing parties winning in traditionally working-class districts in England, Italy, Portugal, many places. Why that's happening is they're at least pretending. The left isn't even pretending. What is the left saying? Oh, you know what? You're just like, you don't have enough class consciousness, my friend. Actually, you should stop thinking about this issue. You're wrong. You know, we need to teach you the correct view. Or this is not an issue. And, you know, this is where we get back into the PMC and all this stuff. But it's like, in some ways, you know, you can hold an open borders position from a communist position and that you want a stateless, classless society. But yeah, what does that get you in a capitalist context? Rationalization for a policy that in practice is horrible for labor. It makes no sense for labor. Oh, you want to build a workers' movement? But how, if it's harder to build a workers' movement because workers are competing with more and more laborers willing to work for less, and thus they can't unionize or else they'll get fired, which is why telling them they don't have enough class consciousness sounds really tone deaf, because they would never understand, these Marxist students and university professors telling workers who would get fired and lose their whole fucking life support in an instant if they organize because they can get replaced by a migrant, telling them that, oh, this doesn't matter and you just need to organize together for the revolution and wait till capitalism's over before you come. It's just so ridiculous. And that's how
even 150 years.
Even
they just keep saying that for 150 years.
Yep.
It's just like, how is telling people that actually getting you anywhere? Oh, you just don't know your own workers. You're just like, you just need to work with them. It's just like, 150 years of saying that. How's that working out? Right. And you're getting insane backlash. I haven't gone deep down the Twitter pipeline to chase
God.
all of this, but there are people that everyone wants to lump us in with who have just blocked you because one stupid person was calling you names based on your like Bernie Sanders-esque take on borders. But basically, I'm just saying the immigration thing is insane. It's actually insane, right? Like you're not allowed to say anything about it except for like the Cato Institute position, which is just like, why do we need borders at all? Right? Like that's the only position that you can have is the Cato Institute position.
Yeah, and that's how even radical left ideology ends up being shock troopers for capitalism, because the Marxists aren't like, it's not like the accommodationalist rainbow progressive capitalism. They are explicitly anti-capitalist, still acknowledge, right, that like immigration is bad for wages, that it's bad for particularly labor power, for organizational bargaining power. That's the big thing. It's actually more detrimental than the wages itself. And they will acknowledge that, but they'll say, okay, waiting for the revolution. And for now, it's just a pointless. This is the thing. Marxists have this tendency to accept progress as inevitable and things that are symptomatic of capitalism as unchangeable until you get rid of capitalism. So they'll say like, oh, immigration still happens even though there is a border. So therefore it's just oppressive to have a border and to begin with, and you should just not have one. It's inhumane. So they're rationalizing it and making the problem worse. And it's like, it ends up kind of bolstering capital in two ways. It rationalizes what's happening as something inevitable until you just change the whole system, which is not going to happen because they're totally impotent as a political force because they can't get anyone on their side. And by being self-contained opposition, impotent, self-marginalized, self-contained, controlled opposition, they in practice are shock troopers for capitalism, because what better future could a capitalist world want than communists who are like, every single like Marxist person, they're never working class. And at least I'm been self-aware that I'm like a PMC person, might have like, working class parents and whatever. Like I'm PMC in terms of what I do and where I was in the last like 7 years. I'm like self-aware of that. Yeah, like very self-aware of that. Man, I've met people with Karl Marx tattoos talking about organizing the workers. Karl Marx tattoos on their shoulders, dog. Wearing Gucci. Talking about organizing the workers.
You met Hassan Piker?
No, I'm not even talking about Hassan Piker. But yes, he fits the bill too.
I'm joking.
Dude, he fits the bill too. He totally does. I mean, he's the embodying character trope of that. Like the embodied perfect example of that. But I mean, that's just more obvious. I think even a lot of the Marxists who will LARP a little bit as like, but that's the thing, that helps beat capitalism. It doesn't matter what you believe. Right. It doesn't matter if you think X or Y. If your ideas are functioning to make the socialist movement more impotent and pushing people to the right, which is what it's doing, no amount of convincing you it's going to change that, then you are functioning to be a shock trooper for capitalism. In the same way you are whenever you like try to police anyone who has like any common sense. I started to realize something was deeply wrong when all the people I liked would get attacked. Like, and I sometimes get this diss thrown at me and I see it as a compliment. You know what? The other day I saw this comment. It said, oh, he's going. It's so disappointing. One time's going the route of Catherine Liu, Theory Underground, and Adolf Reed. I'm like, okay, so the people who have common sense got it.
Dude, hey, first of all, I'll take that as a compliment as well, being lumped in there, but Dr. Adolf Reed is not a joke. He's like a heavyweight. And Catherine Liu's, she's spicy, she's polemical, she's funny, she's smart, she goes to bat with these people a lot of the time. Like, I think it's not the worst thing to be categorized with them, that's for sure. But someone was literally like referring to you as bad because you are like Adolf Reed and Catherine. What would even be the comment? What's the commonality here? I literally don't even know.
what the thesis of these like woke progressives, and which includes Marxists who might not want to call themselves woke, but they act like woke because they get very offended. And if they'll call you right-wing deviationists and cosplay like they're in the Second International, but there'll be 40-year-old men doing this, by the way. It's really bad. You see like people like this, their way of thinking, their hypothesis is that this critique of the left, it'll lead to inevitably the right wing. You'll just end up being like on Fox News, you'll be a Tucker Carlson talk show host. And their evidence for this is Red Scare hosts. You know? And none of it deals with the symptom. None of it deals with the symptom, which is why is this a tendency? Why are people critical of the left? Oh, so we're gonna do the self-fulfilling prophecy thing, where we're gonna say, if you are critical of the left, and you still have socialist ideas, but if you are critical of the left in this way, break from its orthodoxies, its problems, you must be part of the right. So you know what we're going to do? We're going to try as hard as possible to drive you to the right. And so to prove us,
Yes.
to prove our point.
Exactly. Yeah. To go.
And I don't want to fall into that trap, because that's giving them what they want. Do you know what I mean?
It's a slippery slope theory of political contamination. Is what it is. Oh, if you start thinking that way, then you'll start thinking this way, then you'll start thinking that way, then you'll end up over here. And by the way, I just want to throw out there, I also don't want to give them what they want, but also I don't want to have my actual path, much less discourse, be structured by trying to negate giving them what they want. So I would just say this. I would go on Tucker Carlson. I would go on Tucker Carlson if I felt like, if I needed to say something and I thought that it actually needed to get out to a lot of people, and that was an avenue, but talking to Rachel Maddow was not an avenue, then of course I would take the avenue given to me. In the same way that if you're a Black family in the city and your son is unjustly killed by a cop, you're going to go on MSNBC. And if you are a young father whose child has been taken away because the psychiatrist was suggesting to your child that they might be trans, and then you're like, hey, what is this that you're keeping from me? And they're like, we're taking your child away now. Yeah, you're going to go on Fox. If that's the only place that you can talk about your issue, then you're going to go there. And that's part of the issue with the you must choose mommy or choose daddy kind of thing, is like real bad things happen to people, and then to articulate it or get any kind of other people in on the issue or attention on the issue, it requires choosing a side, right? Like I met the father of a Hispanic teenager who had been killed by the police in California, and he was a Trump supporter who over the course of 5 years had become like a BLM activist. And it's because these are the people who will speak to his issue, his number one issue. Of course, he's still pro-life. Of course, he's still pro-border. Of course, he's still anti-PC. But here he is doing stuff with BLM because this is the only side that cares about. Obviously, the most important thing in his life now has to do with like the fact that his son was murdered. And so it's like that. You get the same thing. People aren't right-wing, but only right-wing media is willing to address the issue that has become the biggest issue for you because you're living through it, right? And so it's just like, yeah, an existential thing happens to you. And now all of a sudden there's a side that has monopolized the audience that is able to even take you seriously. So yeah, I'd go on Tucker if I was dealing with something that
me too. And then the only thing I would just say is like I would go on Tucker and I'd probably talk about Christian socialism, or I would try to just add something to the table of the discourse, something that his audience isn't used to hearing, as opposed to just going there and like ranting about stuff that like his audience would already agree with. But I would absolutely go on. Right. See why not? Like, yeah, I mean, that's a goal of mine. Like, I would love to be able to go on Candace Owens and talk about Christian socialism. That'd be fucking awesome. You know? Talk about how
that would be so
free market
sick,
and satanic, and oh man, I could totally see that. But
I emailed her about the Kirk anthology actually, and then I had a back and forth. Yeah, I had an email back and forth with her AI. She has an AI assistant, and so I had a whole chain of emails with Candace's AI assistant. Yeah, but because I emailed like 30 different news outlets that are mainstream and alternative and left and right and center about the Kirk anthology. And the main one that was interested was the Washington Post, which, by the way, is owned by Jeff Bezos. And they asked me to write a 750-word op-ed about the ban and the censorship. And so I did. And then they just said, oh, no, we're not going to do it. Thanks. And I was like, you know, I know it's a good piece. Like, it's a solid, you know, Washington Post level op-ed. It's not that. And so it's like, it is interesting. But I'm over here like, I think most people are just bored by the topic of censorship because there's so much of it and there's always so many stories about it that it's not that interesting for people. I think everyone's kind of become numb to it. That's what's going on.
Yes. It's yeah, like, well, you can tell someone's a shock trooper for capitalism when they want to silence anything that is critical of their side, and they are more obsessed with being like against the right. This is the thing, the fight the right is what leftism is defined as. And you know, okay, this question of the post left, the reason why I don't like the categories is because they want to lump you in with like Red Scare and all that shit. And it's like, I find that stupid. What does that even mean? Do you know what I mean? I never listened to I don't listen to Red Scare. Like, it's not something I ever really listened to. I know, like, it doesn't, but it's like,
I tried. I just literally can't do it. It's a different kind of humanity that can listen to that stuff. I don't relate to it at all. Like, I'm not a dime square socialist, and I never was one. And I don't relate to the people who are, and I don't have anything against them, but I also just literally don't feel strongly about any of that stuff. And it just couldn't be further from my reality. So it's just like,
right.
When people, that was always my issue with the post left moniker. The other one is that there's an actual tradition called post left, which was like it's a form of anarchism that it comes out of Europe, and it's anti-worker. And so, you know, the term sucks, but at the same time, recently someone suggested that the difference between Theory Underground and these other sort of post-Bernie, sort of post-Marxist podcast sphere, Red Scare type of post-lefts is that Theory Underground is the first instance of a theoretical post-left. And I go, okay, well, I'm not against that interpretation, because there would be the dumb version, the sort of like, I'm just reacting how I feel. And then there would be the, no, we're going to be cool, calm, collected. We're going to be measured. We're going to take our time. We're going to do some rigorous theory and really think about things. And if maybe, but also the issue with it is that I fear that then the goal would be the goal of most people in the world of theory, which is either like trying to influence Christianity or influence the left or influence the right. It becomes trying to influence the post left to try to make it better or something. It's just like, I'm not interested in that either. So, yeah.
Well, I think also the real pill is not to think of this as like a bunch of teams, because you would also want a world where all of those sides are better. Like, you know,
Yes.
Studebaker said this in one of the episodes we did, where he said, sometimes the question isn't just like, are you going to like help your team and beat the other team or get more influence? You also like got to think, is this sort of politics going to make the other sides worse or better?
Mm-mm.
Because in a pluralist society, and especially a deep pluralist age, as you would say, you know, this idea that there's going to be one movement is a total fantasy. There's not going to be one movement. There also never was one movement. It's another thing. There's always been a bunch of movements that converge, and especially in a very divided world like today. This idea of the left, it's completely fantasy oriented, which is that there's a side, right? Like a team. Most of these people have diametrically opposed ideas a lot of the time. Ideas that, if in a political context, would lead to the Civil War, like serious differences.
Right.
It is just not, it's a fiction. And I think the reason why people say, you know, because you think about it, like when you think about what a rightist is, it's not a term people use, and it's not really clear what comes to mind. Unless you're like a real echo chamber leftist, they might have like a stereotype of what a leftist is. They think like what a rightist is, which is like everyone must be like Charlie Kirk or Ben Shapiro, even though there's a lot of diversity on the right. Like, for example, Patrick Deneen, right? And Curtis Yarvin are critical of liberalism for completely different reasons. One is more
For totally different reasons.
One is, more decentralization of power from a Christian traditionalist point of view. One of them is wants a dictatorship, a CEO monarch, because he thinks that the current system doesn't really let stuff get done as fast. And by getting done, he's ultra capitalist Silicon Valley type of guy. Very different objectives. He's very different. He would say himself, he says he's to the right of fascism, which is that he believes in hierarchy to such a degree that he doesn't believe in even, the kind of race, the same kind of race stuff the Nazis do, because he thinks that even like humans are so unequal that why should we appease the fucking peasants of, the white peasants? Like, he has such a real aristocratic hierarchical view. That's the
Right.
thing. Insofar as left and right are meaningful, they are these relative categories, that it's like hierarchy, equality, sure. But like, where does traditions and stuff like that fit into it? I don't think tradition is at odds, but not all tradition, not all conservatism is at odds with socialism. And in fact, I think it's actually the more consistent position. I don't think moderate, small c conservative in culture and socialist in economics, which is what Lasch described himself as, it's what Daniel Bell described himself as, and it's what I would describe Byung-Chul Han as well. Someone very much, and I would say Zizek called himself a conservative communist, right? He's kind
Right.
of
Yeah. No. Yep. 100%. And I would also throw in Alistair McIntyre with that. Yeah. You said Patrick J. Deneen. I'd say Timothy Carney also counts. Yeah. 100%.
Deneen, I'm not as sure, but he's definitely more on the egalitarian end. But I would say I don't know. He's hard to categorize. I've only read Why Liberalism Failed, and that was actually after you'd recommended it way back, and I had it on my list because of Victor Brazone was trying to get me to read it too. But it's so okay. I don't think that's a oxymoron or some kind of new synthesis. Maybe it is a new synthesis, but I think it's actually the most consistent position. Whereas progressivism, I
agree.
think, is more consistent with capitalism.
I want to say, first of all, I agree, but also I feel like my audience at this point, maybe 20 to 30% of them will find the question I'm about to ask you meaningful. Whereas I think that 95% of your audience would probably find this meaningful. And that is what about the problem or trap of Tailism? So yeah, lay it on me. Explain what that means.
I love this chart.
People. Explain the people who say it and what they mean and why they care. And then let's talk about why that's not relevant here.
So Tailism is this idea that in order to win politically, you should follow what is popular and basically reinforce or play into popular sentiments of the masses. For example, let's say there's anti-Semitism is popular. You should play into anti-Semitism to get more popular. Or let's say there's a big, homophobia is popular. You should just play into homophobia. So that's the charge, right? It comes out of Mao, actually, because Mao was trying to make a case for understanding the peasants, for reaching the peasants, Wait,
I thought that Lenin was charging people with Tailism too. No.
Yeah, Lenin used it too, actually, but Mao, I think, popularized it. If I'm if I'm not mistaken, because Maoists use this language. I at least first heard it from Maoists and from Mao, the text that they often bring it from. But yeah, I think Lenin did use it too. Tailism, it's basically tailing, reactionary ideas in the working class. Now, look, there might be reactionary ideas all over society, whatever, or I would just say, I don't like to think of it in terms of reactionary. There could just be not very good ideas, like anti-Semitism. Why is anti-Semitism not good? Well, take ideas to their logical conclusion. It's a thought experiment. You know who did take anti-Semitism to its logical conclusion? Well, we don't need a repetition of that, do we? It's why I don't focus much on race and IQ. Sure, there's differences between ethnicities, perhaps. Yeah, sure, probably. So what? What's your point? We did this already. Eugenics. The idea is judging their bad by judging by their effects, not whether reactionary this or this. Eugenics
Right.
used to be a progressive idea. First off, that's worth pointing
No,
out.
I was reading a progressive treatise on eugenics recently. I went down this rabbit hole because people were talking about the eugenics roots of Planned Parenthood, and I was like, I actually
yeah.
wanted to go down. So Margaret Singer's the guy that she was reading, who radicalized her, also radicalized Hitler when he was in prison. Like, I mean, by the time he was in jail or whatever, he was already pretty radicalized, obviously. But then he was reading this book. I'll dig it up while we're doing this, and I'll be able to say the actual title. But it is progressive. It is progressive. It is, dude. The craziest thing about maybe my new favorite historical period, actually, the beginning of the 1900s, when progressives would just say the quiet part out loud. It's so crazy. Yeah. But anyway, sorry. Yeah, continue. So tailing anti-Semitism, tailing eugenics. We don't have to say, oh, I don't do that because it's reactionary. We can say, I don't like that because it doesn't work for these reasons.
All right, you asked me about Tailism. Yeah.
Right. I just want to say, yeah. So the book that I was talking about is called The Revolt Against Civilization. And
Ooh.
it's basically arguing that the menace of civilization is the underman. And this book is by Lothrop Stoddard from Harvard. And he is arguing that the underman is the biggest threat to civilization, which is to say the weak, the disabled, the low IQ. Like that is what the whole book is about. And so this was a very influential book on, yeah, the founders of Planned Parenthood as well as on Hitler. And so Daily Wire typed conservatives make a big deal of that. And that's why I was like, they talk about it like it's like the literal worst thing ever, but also the quotes. It just sounds like that time when progressives would say the quiet part out loud. So I'm going to go down that rabbit hole because whenever I hear that kind of thing, I like to go to the source. And yeah, reading it, it's like a very powerful case for eugenics. It's very seductive. And you can see why Nick Land, for instance, is very pro-eugenics, and which is to say, if you are a high IQ person and you see a lot of stupidity around you, it's seductive. It is a seductive ideology.
Oh, yeah.
It's not one that you can, and when the Daily Wire types, or like when a certain kind of socialist type, it's just like, oh, it's ableist, or, oh, it's just not Christian because it doesn't see us all as created in the image of God, which would be the Daily Wire approach. What they're missing is, no, but this is like the deep intellectual roots of the thing. You can't just call it an ism. Oh, it's racist, or, oh, it's this, and then write it off. You actually have to deal with the sort of base evolutionary biology, ideology, materialism thing going on. Like that, you actually have to engage with that. So, yeah.
You just
Anyway.
remind me of something fascinating because, okay. So, look, yeah, just to reinforce what you're saying there, like it was progressives who advocated eugenics. It was like, for example, the Fabian Society in Britain, who's behind the Labour Party. And, these are like statist sort of reformist socialists. They were, and Orwell was very critical of them, by the way. George Orwell was critical of them and the Bolsheviks in an interesting way. He thought they were this kind of micromanagers trying to manage everyone in society and create like the perfect human by managing people as they liked. That's why he was, yeah. So like, the thing about eugenics, right, is, yeah, if you look at the progressives who supported it, even Tommy Douglas, who I quite, was one of my favorite Canadian leaders of all time, leader of the CCF, he believed in that too. If you can find a funny thing on television when he said, I think we should really treat homosexuals with compassion. We should finally recognize homosexuality for what it is, a mental illness. But like, and he said it in like the sympathetic way, like as if that was the progressive position. Now, look, if you look at like eugenics, its aims, and then you look at its effects, what was it used to do is to, sterilize black people, sterilize native people, sterilize disabled people. And it's like, look, that kind of power in the wrong hands is very dangerous. It's also like, it's just, where does it end? I feel like this kind of the problem with I have with eugenics really is like I can kind of get the rationale for it. So we shouldn't just like dismiss it in this arbitrary way, but I think it's kind of like it all plays into this like cyborg world, which is this obsession with the world without limits of perfecting human, this transhumanist ideology. It's like, I'm kind of all very critical of that shit, to be honest. Like, where is it going to end? Do you know what I mean? Oh,
But I'm probably okay with a little bit of soft eugenics. Like there's like this like there's this little spectrum of soft. This the soft eugenics spectrum starts with, well, I'm going to be very selective about my mate.
Right. Well, yeah,
it starts with that.
Everyone is.
It starts there.
Yeah.
It starts there,
like,
but then
Malcolm
the harder side of the soft eugenics spectrum, which is maybe the edgiest take I've dropped on the internet this year, was on. It's not that bad, but it was about the Elon Musk releasing all of this like hentai, like live anime girlfriend stuff, and people were like, "Oh my god, this is gonna be the end of the human race. All these guys are never gonna get girlfriends now." And I was like, I retweeted it, and I was like, think about the bright side of this though, is that like these people are literally going to remove themselves from the gene pool. I'm okay with that.
They already say men are the disposable sex. They reproduce on a lower rate than women do in terms of their own genes. They're less likely to reproduce.
Yeah. I mean, and it's sad. Obviously, any guy that I know, like I wish the best for him, and I hope that he will not become a sad little goon cave dwelling loser. But at the same time, also, it's like, I don't want the sad little goon cave dweller reproducing. So it is kind of like
oh boy, that's, I don't know about that. I know. I feel like, so look, this is where eugenics loses me a lot in its determinism. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like all of it is just like, it's why I'm critical of ID poll. I thought that identity politics on the left, racialism was going to lead inevitably to white supremacy, and it was going to lead to gene stuff. Which I feel like, look, genetics is for the right, what like vulgar materialism is for the left, which is like, oh, you can't change it. It's just genetics, or it's just history. It's just material conditions. Or it's just the system. It's just systemic. Oh, I can't do anything. Responsibility is stupid. It's just systemic. And then for the right is eugenics. You made this point on our pod, right? But you got to clarify, man. You can't be dropping that fucking telling the deplorable is not to reproduce. Look, and this is what I'd also say. Sure, in theory, look, there's a lot of people I think shouldn't reproduce.
No.
But
I'm not saying. Let me clarify. I'm not saying that a deplorable is deplorably or determined to be deplorable by genetics. I'm just saying that if you choose a lifestyle that is pathetic and deplorable, and it has you remove yourself from the gene pool, that's not too bad. And part of the reason is because, first of all, if you did have kids, those kids could grow up to be all kinds of great things. But the point is you're probably not going to be a very good parent. And so I'm just saying that it's not the worst thing ever. It's not, to me, like saying, oh, they undermine the integrity of our genetic code or something. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, yeah, you probably suck. And so you could choose to not be deplorable. You could choose to make your life epic and do something awesome. You could do that.
Yeah. Something you reminded me of, though, in this eugenics talk's not where I expected to go. But, if you remember almost, I think like a year and a half ago or longer, when we were doing proposals for one of the Theory Underground books, or I forget which one, I had a proposal which was on Marxism and Darwinism and the connection. And it was called What Was Socialism For? And I was trying to like take what a Marxist rationale for socialism would be to its logical conclusion. Because if you ask a Marxist what socialism is for, what communism is for, they will say it's for freedom. Then I will say, well, freedom for what? And the closest I could pinpoint to Marx was freedom to actualize human potential. And I thought, okay, well, and then also you talked about evolution. He talks about how basically, essentially, it's like enlightenment for the rest of the species. I'm thinking evolution. Okay, so goal of socialism is evolution. And there's other people who've had this conception, evolution. There's a whole school of Darwinian socialism and the way in which Marx and Engels liked Darwin, and then people like Kautsky, Bernstein, they took up Darwin and actually applied it in their work to a certain
Right.
degree. And I try to take it to its conclusion because I really like to think like, okay, what is like a materialist objective view of the good look like? Because problem with Marxism, right, is it doesn't have it claims to not be prescriptive, but it really is. Then I thought, okay, well, if this good is based on evolution, let's try to take it. So the more I explored it, to be honest, part of why I don't want to say dropped the project because I might still write it, but I definitely like it took me down a very spooky territory.
Oh, really?
Well, look, okay. There's this book by Benjamin Lind called A Evolutionary Left, and it's called Why the Woke Needs to Wake Up to Darwin.
Oh, shit.
In it, he basically advocates for kind of like socialist progressive eugenics. And the thing is, if you go for this like evolution is like the goal of socialism, you end up in a terrain where it's not like evolution itself gets fetishized as something that is good, kind of like the way progress gets fetishized as something is good. So stuff that's just more efficient, more, for example, like, oh, we're like living longer, right? That's like a perfect example. Living longer is just unambiguously good. Doesn't matter the condition or quality of life. You're just living longer, good. Or you get like Daniel, what's that fucking guy everyone likes to make fun of, the immortal guy. Looks like he's 30 years younger than he is. He's a vampire.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, okay, so what is socialism exactly? It's basically like what's happening under capitalism now, but for everybody. Is that what I understand? And that's kind of what you get in a lot of communist sort of circles. If you look at like fully automated luxury communism is a fantasy. What is it but like capitalism for everybody? Do you know what I mean? Like it's like everyone's just kind of bourgeois. But if you look at the bourgeoisie, they suffer a different kind of alienation that in some ways is bad too and causes mental illness. Like excessive materialism, they have their issues with their family, they have their ego issues, they have also temptation, and they get, don't get me started on, the kids with rich parents. Like that's a whole fucking thing. Look at the Trudeaus and their kids. This is a trope for a reason. So it's like evolution itself. It's like, okay, with more material abundance and maybe we can have men be, okay, whatever, people be more efficient, have like prosthetic arms and live longer and can have food delivered to them like they're in Wall-E. And I'm thinking, okay, what is the future here? Oh, in genetic modification, okay, we want to modify our kids to be, to be like higher IQ, to not have autism, to not have whatever. What is that? Where does this all go?
Whatever's trending. Whatever's
And
trending is what we'll want to modify them as, right?
Well, yeah,
That's the scary part. It'll be commercialized trends that people are modifying their children to be. Like, the obvious example being like, oh, blue eyes are in, so everybody's going to want their blue-eyed children. But yeah, well, what about when some of the parents start doing that with the kids? Now they have tails and cat ears. Like that, we're very close. We're very close. Like this is we're so close that it makes it so that when there's these big fights at schools about like, should the child be allowed to identify as a dog or a cat and eat on all fours out of a bowl on the floor? And I know two people in my life who have had this happen at a local school. So this is not an isolated incident. The one was in Australia. The other one was in Colorado. Okay. Colorado and Australia. So this is a thing that's going on. School boards can't deal with this issue because it's close enough to the trans thing that some parents use the talking points of the trans thing. And obviously most parents are like, this is bullshit. But the point is the reason that it's not funny, and I know you're laughing, but it is funny. But the reason it's also like, oh, sobering is because we're so close to these kinds of parents who go for this kind of thing, being able to, one, genetically modify their child before they're born, and two, do stuff to them even after they're born. Like at the age of 5 or whatever, the kid will be like, I want a monkey tail. I get to have a monkey tail. And the parents are, okay, kid, I'll do that for you. And so it's just like, it's, you know, this is the trajectory. So what is the good life in a world where that's plausible, right?
Yeah. What is the good life? I don't want socialism to just be the democratization of capitalist degeneracy. And that's what it is for these people. Like, think about it. You know, it's like, oh, rich people can modify themselves forever and, you know, they can do all this. And it's like, that's kind of what fully automated luxury communism seems to me. It's like Wall-E for everybody.
All right. And also, by the way, because very few people can find meaning in such a future, I think it actually makes the Warhammer 40K future more likely, because the more spineless
Warhammer 40K.
Yeah, which is basically like genetically modified super trooper imperialist expansion, conquer the universe, kind of like the opposite of Star Trek, right? Like, it's just saying like, nope, the future is all out war and expansion and imperialism and just embracing strength. And it is space fascism essentially. But what I'm saying though is that, like, you know, it is like Warhammer 40K is like the most profitable, largest hobby for guys in our age range, playing video games, the new TV show coming out, the tabletop game, like all that shit. And the people who play the game are like the softest, Wall-E-esque, by and large ship living kinds of middle class people. And they're getting off on space fascism and running around with like basically roided out stormtroopers. And I'm not saying that it's not cool. It is a very cool sort of franchise, but that's the future that people actually want when they spend too much time in the comfort zone. Like, the repressed will to power sublimates itself in a variety of ways. And one way for a lot of guys is this sort of like, yes, I'm a soft boy, but also I want space fascism. And so, you know, I'm just saying that is what the fully automated gay space communism people are actually setting up as, in contrast, a meaningful alternative, because it's at least exciting, unlike this boring limitlessness that they're endorsing.
That's kind of what Baudrillard makes fun of this when he says, like, you know, we already live in communism. We already live in the utopia, and it's terrible. Or Fukuyama's prediction in End of History, which is that, you know, communism, actually existing communism anyway, competed with capitalism on its own terms. And if you look at it, capitalism beat it on its own terms, which is, you know, abundance, consumer goods and all that. And it will probably, you know, get closer to achieving what it wanted to. And his prediction is that actually the resistance will come from, you know, what at the time will seem like right-wing forces, which it'll be megalothymia and desires for meaning, you know, desires against, you know, revolt against comfort, and we want a purpose. I think why Star Trek is appealing is because it envisions a kind of high-tech world without like the kind of degeneracy. It's like still where they have a meaning and no one's stupefied. But I feel like at the current trajectory, where if liberation is the goal and it's all about like freedom as opposed to like duty, purpose, and order, what you will get is something closer to Wall-E or like Brave New World than, you know, Star Trek or something like that. Or Solar Punk Future, because, you know, I think about even what's happening with capitalism, right? It's like you have declines of families and you have this attempt to accommodate it through childcare. And the communist goal, you know, with the people who actually believe in that, is like collective child rearing. And I think, you know, the end goal of this is Brave New World, unironically, which is like test tube babies. And, you know, some come out and say it. I talked to certain socialist guys called Socialist Done Something. And he unironically was like, when I talked to him about the birth rate thing, because he was dismissing the birth rate as a problem, you know, a declining population. And he said, well, you know, that we'll eventually fix this with basically test tube babies, you know, with like, you know, a bill. And it's like, great, then we'll liberate women from motherhood, gender abolition. liberation,
is
great. Equality. Equality is when we all become cyborgs.
Yeah, no, this is a classic second wave feminist position, actually. And it's also, weirdly enough, the position of Simone and Malcolm Collins. They actually advocate for test tube babies being the solution to this crisis as well, while at the same time believing, those of us who know better should have big families. But yeah, man, just actually, I do want to get back to the Tailism thing, but I just will say that one of the things that Collins helped me think about, though, is like that you really can judge an ideology also by whether or not it is able to sustain and reproduce itself over long periods of time, generation to generation. And that the thing about the global urban monoculture is that it is not capable of doing that without preying on other people's kids, right? It's a city approach to, we'll just take the disaffected youth from the rural areas, and then they'll come in. But the idea that they'll reproduce, no, that's not really a thing. Or maybe they'll have like 1.5 kids in their 30s, right?
The reason why I think people, like some leftists, will freak out at any talk about any of these things is because it's one thing to do this sort of self-criticism, right? Where you say, guys, we need to be better on this issue. The real radical position is getting at the core. Radical is getting at the root of things, realizing that the foundations are fucked. And that is much more terrifying, which is why I think there's almost an existential reaction in which some leftists, especially the influencers who are most keen on policing because that's their whole brand, their whole identity that they've concocted for themselves, is selling this thing called leftism. So they will, when they hear talks that, what, I know this certain individual who really went after me, who tried to block me in vague posts, his number one issue he had was my critique of actually the sociology of the left. I was pointing at certain types of leftists who reject any kind of local, national, cultural identity and who appeal to like vague internationalisms. They have a socialization of what could be called a, everywhere and a nowhere, which is like there's an old term that is, I don't like to use because of its associations, but rootless cosmopolitan, which is a person who's in a big city, kind of not rooted anywhere to any like particular culture, doesn't identify with anything, or is just an outcast. That's a big part of it. It might just be outcast. It might be weird for whatever reason. And as a result, they identify with, stuff that's very antisocial in character. They have a contempt almost for common standards, things that are common, normie culture. It's like the kill all normies culture. And when I was talking about there's another sociology of this, which is like they would have just been globalist liberals, limousine liberals, but they're often fallen liberals, people who are socialized to become liberals, but aren't that. So they end up, cosplaying to fantasy vanguardist world. I didn't mention anyone directly. I didn't even have anyone that much in mind when writing it, but I think that struck a nerve because that gets at the core of the whole sociology. Right. That gets at the core of like what is driving the thing. And to be fair, you can be right for the wrong reasons. People can be right for wrong reasons, but it does make one question this whole tailism thing. Because when people say, oh, you're just tailing the masses. Well, what if they are right and you're wrong? Why is that not even considered? So that it's like I'm against tailism because I'm against opportunistically taking beliefs just because they're popular. But what if the real pill is realizing that there's stuff that is popular or stuff that is, or rejected by the majority because of the truth? Like that is like, it is points to a real truth. Like in that maybe there's a mass reaction against mass migration because it is a problem.
Right.
Maybe a lot of people are rejecting wokeism because it sucks. Not just its appearance. It just sucks.
Right.
And it's
and it's not just the co-optation. It's not just the co-optation. It's not just the performance. No, at its root, it's an issue. Right? At its root, it is an ideology that is for people who have left their families, left their towns, and who have no desire to ever return, but want to spend the rest of their lives speaking on behalf of other people and gatekeeping discourse, which is where the discursive Taylorism thing comes in. The self-appointed representative, virtue hoarding PMC type, right? Like this has become an endemic or sort of an inescapable problem for anyone, anywhere that the three crises of the attention economy, activism, or academia are colliding. Like anyone, anywhere where those three worlds collide, it's inescapable. Of course, like the normies in my life might only have a little taste of it here and there because they're not living in the center of that Venn diagram. You and I, though, or anyone who seeks to do work remotely close to what we're doing, exists where those three fields, the attention economy, activism, and academia, where those things collide, right? And so the problem of the falling professional is also the problem of ever increasingly competitive criteria for being the authentic and good spokesperson for some community. Yeah. So,
And that's the and what this person who critiqued that critique I was making, like about all that, their thing was, you shouldn't psychologize people you disagree with. You should attack their argument. I'm like, well, I attack the argument, but the psychologizing is related to the argument. And a part of that is if you look at there's certain ideas that have parallels, and you see why. Why do leftists tail liberals? It's because they're cut from the same cloth. On paper, they disagree with each other, but they can't hit you. The leftists can't fully hit the liberal in a real hard way without hitting himself. Right. Because they're cut from similar cloths, and that's why they act in similar ways and come off similar ways, and why a lot of the public can't discern a difference between leftist and liberal. And a perfect example of that is certain ideological currents you see that I would say are downstream of either someone who has landed a PMC job, they're a successfully integrated professional in one of these symbolic capitalist industries. Musa al-Gharbi, We've Never Been Woke, adds a whole new level of legitimacy to your analysis, by the way. It's incredible. I have a pod coming out with him. He talks about elite overproduction, and he talks about symbolic capitalist industries, which is I think very accurate because it's a part of the PMC, which is basically academia, the media, art, and entertainment. Industries that have to deal with the reproduction of symbols and thus the reproduction of ideology, hence why this small group of people has such a big influence at discourse, but actually is out of touch politically. We've Never Been Woke. Yes, it's so good. I learned so much. And there's so much,
I'm gonna buy that shit.
It is.
I'm buying that
good.
shit for. It's only $3 on Audible. I'm buying that right now.
I guarantee you, the only reason he was able to publish that book, given what it says is so damning about liberals and parts of the left, that I think it's because he's a black Muslim, probably why he got away with it. I think he even made that joke himself. That's part of why he was able to publish it. But he's a very, very intelligent guy, sociologist. Operates in the vein of Pierre Bourdieu. He's kind of taking that. That's how he gets the idea of symbolic capitalists. And I know you're all about that.
That's
so
my
it's
shit,
right up your alley.
dude. That's my shit. Yeah, fuck. I got to this guy then. That's really cool. At the point that I start doing things with other people again, I'll have to bring him on.
I can maybe tell him about Theory Underground. He'd be for a good contributor too, I think.
Yeah. Well, especially to this the anthology tied to that course I was plugging earlier, the Philosophy of Stewardship and Home Economics one, is going to be published towards the end of next year. And so basically, I will be over the course of 2026 looking for some cool contributions from people. And then a few of the standout pieces written by students at TU are also going to be included in that. I
just want to wrap the point about why I brought up al-Gharbi. So they're cut. Yeah. What he's showing is how the sociology of the fallen professionals and the integrated ones, the ones who basically get integrated into the symbolic capitalist industries as part of the PMC, are more or less, they adopt a sort of liberal attitude of guilt a lot of the time because they're actually guilty about their privilege. and will focus on a certain type of politics that is about exonerating guilt. So it'll be about white privilege. It'll be about changing the names of statues and all this kind of stuff and symbolic gestures. Yeah. And even maybe breadcrumbs for the poors. You'll get a kind of radical edge of this, which you saw right after Occupy Wall Street, because a lot of fallen professionals couldn't get new jobs due to the stagnant economy. So you had a bunch of people who got degrees expecting to be part of the symbolic capitalist elite, top 20%. So what do? Now, this is where liberalism takes on a more radical edge, it seems. And they'll adopt slogans like, we are the 99%. Convenient, huh? To leave themselves out of the elite. When in reality, it's like, it's more like a 10 to 20% range.
Yeah.
They
I'm
leave
pretty
them.
sure you're in the top 10 there. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They like to, and they end up supporting a kind of, left-wing politics that's conveniently, perfectly, like, just anti-bourgeois enough that I'll support like wealth taxes, but it'll be conveniently for stuff like expanding bureaucracies in which they are basically part of these bureaucracies that would be in charge of distributing how this money gets given to the poor. Like, the poor don't really get to decide actually what to do with their property and money. It's like, we just want to like make the rich pay more, and the working class, like, it's just backward. It's kind of brainwashed. It's us who are enlightened, right? This Brahmin mentality, But like,
Priest
okay,
class shit. Yeah.
I would say this affects Leninism. So like, people who get obsessed with, they get into like Marxism, Leninism. Part of why a lot of them come out of the academies, because they're also chronically unemployed or underemployed. And they essentially, they'll act like liberals, they'll act woke as hell, because they are socialized in that same way. And their sort of communism is driven usually by a resentment more than it is an objective interest or a camaraderie with the classes they claim to stand for. They'll usually say, the working class, we need to teach them. They won't say us, because they could never say that with a straight face. They'll say, them, we need to teach them, we need to spread them class consciousness. They'll speak in this way. And you think about what Leninism is, and this is the way, unfortunately, a lot of communism manifests, is basically the ultimate fallen professional fantasy, which is, I would fail to be part of the liberal vanguard. I couldn't write for Jacobin. I couldn't become part of the Democratic Party. I couldn't become part of, I can work for the Squad or whatever. Or just part of leftist academia, for that matter. So instead, I'm going to adopt this vanguardist fantasy, in which I am, in this fantasy, the elite vanguard, guiding the masses to revolution against the people who I want revenge against. And it's easy to say this all psychologization, but once you see it, you can unsee it with certain types who have this kind of politics. And it's why
worth noting. It's worth noting that people who say that kind of stuff like know nothing about or are seemingly incapable of thinking about psychology. It's like that person in particular's entire field of research has literally nothing to do with anything that we care about. And then like the only hobby horse that has anything to do with any of this stuff is just like Marxology or whatever. And so it's just like, that kind of person can't wade through the psychological stuff and then find a way of incorporating it, right? And it's just like, so they just kind of just bracket it out entirely, and they just kind of write off psychology as superstructural or ephemeral. It's like epiphenomenal. It's just like, oh, we'll just write that off. And it's just like, there are psychological things going on here, though. It's not just psychologizing. It's actually, we've got our finger on the pulse of something that's going on, which is like the psychology of a falling elite. That's a real thing. It's been a thing for a long time. It's like when all your politics is driven by guilt, that's a psychology thing. Yes, it's obviously related to material conditions. It's related to political economy, but it's also like manifesting obviously in a psychological way. It's not just manifesting in a psychological way, though, at the point that the Marxologists are also centering, catering to, and being completely oriented in everything that they do by this PMC progressive bourgeois big other. It's like at that point, any possibility for anything radical at all is being captured. It's audience captured. It's not audience captured by a YouTube channel. It's not audience captured by a consumer demographic on the attention economy. It's audience captured by a big other. Like you're literally judging. It's like the person like, oh, I'm a block one dime because he said something that's so outrageous. By whose standard? By this cop that lives inside of your head. By that person's standard. Not by anything else. Right. And so that is psychologizing it at a certain level to bring in the big other. But you'll also notice that these people have no room for anything related to Lacan at all. Like, I think you can go way too deep off into the deep end of the Lacanian thing, but also it's like people do have a big other. Like you could see, and also the Zizekian twist is to expand it, to say that there's the big other and the superego, that they're not the same thing, that the big other is the side of law, rule, symbolic order, whereas like the superego is the more the permissive parent that's telling you to be your best self and enjoy yourself, right? And so it's like, this is where in the Kirk anthology, I actually have a piece where I talk about that bifurcation between the big other and superego being so political, where it really is kind of just, are we just talking about mommy and daddy? And you're addressing yourself to the one that you like the most, right? And I think that is a serious issue. And it's like, yeah, it's not just psychologizing though, right? And all of the great theorists that we like aren't just psychologizing. They're thinking political economy, libidinal economy, and also realizing that human beings have psyches, and that all of that shit is like obviously powerful. So
Yeah, there's Orwell wrote about a lot of this in The Road to Wigan Pier, right? And there's a quote I posted actually on Twitter, a quote from that where he's noticing a tendency that he sees particularly among the Fabian socialist types and Bolsheviks, and it's this kind of tendency we're talking about. A lot of people get freaked out when, there's some people who are really convinced that this PMC critique is inevitably going to lead to like, right wing, blah, blah, blah. It's going to abandon everything. It's going to abandon socialism, whatever. And it's like, first off, like Orwell is someone who was aware of all of this, and he remained a democratic socialist, but he called out bullshit as he saw it. And, they call him an anti-communist. Well, it's like, damn, I think most of us would be, like in such a context. He was actually ahead of the curve on that back when people thought, okay, well, at least Stalin's fighting Hitler,
Right. Right.
Even though they betrayed the anti-fascists in Spain, which Orwell was part of, which is why he became very anti-Stalinist, because he saw how insanely opportunistic, the Soviet Union was in terms of who it would support. I mean, that's why, Greeks really don't fuck with communism, because the communists who were Titoists got betrayed by Stalin. Actually, he so hated the Titoist bloc because he didn't want an independent bloc from the Soviet Empire. He literally basically let the communists in Greece lose the civil war to the fascists. Refuses to support them. And this is not just Stalin. This is a kind of tendency where internationalism, this ideology, gets used for geopolitics, and sometimes more aggressively. So it's like, I think it is important to always psychologize, because psychologizing is like you get aware of bad problems so that you can contain them and prevent them from having the worst excesses. I don't know, like, with this, I forget there's a real particular context why I brought up al-Gharbi and that that's the fallen professional fantasy, and why they're cut from the same cloth and whatnot. Well, why is that important? Well, it explains a lot of the demographic trends we've been seeing, which is this Brahmin left, merchant right alignment, where you see the working class shifting to right-wing parties. And it's not so much that the right-wing parties are all correct about everything, or that the working class just love the right wing, it's because they're the only ones speaking to issues that they actually face. And, the typical PMC thing is to say, oh, well, it's not migrants stealing your jobs. It's, the capitalist system, which we can only get over through evolution. And how that happens exactly, I don't have an answer to that. But the funny thing to me is that it's also not true when they say, oh, they're not stealing your jobs. They're not stealing their jobs because they're in symbolic capitalist industries most of the time, where that has the lowest concentration of migrant labor compared to the service industry or construction or agribusiness. Yeah.
It's the whole, these things are terrible. Look at all the terrible things that there are. Your concerns are heard. Now, the only possible solution for any of this is that you submit yourself to our authority so that we can move towards a one world government where all power will be concentrated into our committee.
The Central Committee.
Cool. Wow, I'm glad I spent some time talking to you about my problems. Damn, and it's just like, it's a black pill, but it's to me like not a reasonable black pill. It's not even like it's not based in reality. It's based in a kind of intellectualism, right? That kind of it comes off as like, oh, I'm just sober and a realist, but it's like, no, the intellectualist part of it in the negative sense, like not to be an anti-intellectualist because obviously I'm an intellectual in a sense, but in the negative sense, and Bourdieu talks about this a lot, the intellectualist approach is to basically be like, oh, if people thought about things the way that I think about things, the problems would be worked out. Oh,
which is wokeism in a nutshell.
No, there you go. You have a bunch of problems. If you could just see things the way that I see things, it would be fine. Mm-hmm. And because the state of affairs is so cruel, and I care so much about the combating the cruelty in the world, it also gives itself over to misanthropy, the hatred of humanity. You touched on this earlier, and I think that it's a really important piece of the puzzle. The natural inclination of intellectualism is misanthropy. If you have a strong or fierce hatred of cruelty, and Judith Shklar is really good for this, that hatred of humanity, or it follows from an intellectualist prioritization of anti-cruelty, because the world is a cruel place and people can be very cruel, right? And so this is where G.K. Chesterton goes really well with Judith Shklar. And it's basically just like, there are a variety of virtues. There's a whole bunch of virtues. The issue with the death of God and of Christendom is not that we live in a society that has no virtues. It's that we live in a society where people discover or seem to care about one virtue, and they don't learn about the other ones, and they don't try to cultivate the other ones. And so that would be Tolstoy for Chesterton, right? That was a man who hated cruelty, right? But the issue with him and his approach to charity is that, yeah, charity is a virtue, but you're not thinking about other virtues, and you're not balancing these things out, right? And so it's funny that Chesterton, I think this is an orthodoxy. He says, the issue is not that we have no virtues. It's that we've become too virtuous after the death of God.
Yeah. And yeah, you have that. Well, that's a classic Christian take too, which is like, one of the threats to religion is actually not the opposite, but mysticism, pseudo religions, a plurality of, many.
Yeah. Like one-dimensionalism, because people don't have a basis in their culture, in their canon, in their life world, they find like they have an intuition for one little piece of the puzzle, and then it becomes the only way that they can see things. Right.
Because the last thing I'll say about Tailism. So,
and then we got to go.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Good way to wrap it up. So the Tailism thing, I think it stems actually from, on the one hand, a kind of elitism, which refuses to recognize that one might be wrong. Like the assumption that if you are recognizing that what is a popular opinion has truth to it, and that an issue that a lot of people care about is indeed an issue, they assume that that is an opportunistic way to appeal to people's backward ideas. Well, that's assuming these ideas are backward and that you know better. That's an elitist assumption. So it's a projection, if anything. Now, I
Can I
do get
say
it could be a real concern
that
because sometimes popular concerns are weaponized, right? And they are weaponized or used in a plebiscitary way, where they're opportunistically kind of appealed to give like little pay lip service, but not actually deal with the problem. I mean, like Trump
yeah.
is a classic Bonapartist in this case. He treats his supporters kind of like plebiscites. But I also think people really don't understand the psychology of a lot of people who vote Trump, which is, a lot of people who vote Trump don't always do it with the idea that like he's going to do everything he says. It's that they just hate the other side more. In the same way that leftists vote Democrat, they just hate the other side more. And that's the thing. Why can't they understand that maybe Trump supporters aren't just all like fucking retarded like blobs who don't understand that Trump might be a pedophile, but that they just really don't fuck with the other side. And then you got to think, wow, if people really didn't like Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris and the Democrats, if they hated them so much that they elected this orangutan Epstein befriending billionaire, that to me is a fucking more of an indictment on the opposition than it is on anything. But you lasted Trump,
exactly.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think it'll
Right.
be interesting because they're not learning. They're saying, oh, we're going to have AOC and a ticket with fucking Kamala against JD Vance. I think they would lose too.
They will lose. Yeah.
It's just,
And I just want to say that the point about Tailism and about, well, what if the populace is right about something? You're assuming that you know what's best. It goes really well with something else that once you see it, you'll never unsee it. And that is that one of the responses to either call out culture or whisper campaigns or the kinds of gatekeeping, which by the way, gatekeeping is based, it's not bad, but the specific combination of call out culture and whisper campaigns that tries to control behavior using targeted harassment and that kind of stuff. One of the reactions to it that is more advanced than just kind of buying into it is to say, hey, we shouldn't just try to exile people for having the wrong opinion. We should actually call in and educate. We should try to call in and educate, right? That is still so condescending and assumes that you're right about everything. Right? Like, oh, those workers are so ignorant. They didn't get the education that we have. We need to be more empathetic to that fact and then just take our time with them and gradually educate them. And it's just like, dude, what if you're just wrong about a lot of shit? Like you fucking might be, right?
Yeah, you'll like Musa
yeah.
al-Gharbi for this. You'll like him because he shows a lot of sociological proof that there's actually like real evidence that intellectuals, people with degrees, are some of the people least likely to change their minds on things, even when confronted with facts. It's because that like, education gives them a sort of pompousness where they assume they are right. They become more dogmatic and more sophisticated at coming up with rationalizations for what they already believe. Right? It's why I'm very against the whole notion of IQ tests for being able to vote, or as some Democrats I saw openly advocating after Trump won again, saying that they think people should have college degrees to vote, which I think is insane. How do you 360 yourself to like the most rightward elitist position? Okay. But this is at the core of like this anti-Tailism, because it's like when people acknowledge that something is true, it's not saying like, it's very different from opportunistically being like, okay, if someone, for example, if people care about immigration, the answer is not to say, don't care about immigration, you're wrong. And it's also not that doesn't mean you have to say, oh yeah, you should care about immigration and that's why you should burn down a mosque or like terrorize Muslims, or that's the Muslims or that whoever immigrants' fault for doing what's in their rational interest because they're allowed to, given the system that exists. You don't have to vilify the people to acknowledge the problem, right? It's like the same way you can look at like be concerned about like you said, puberty blockers at a young age without like vilifying all trans people, right? We want to get rid of all trans people. Like, no. Some people might, like, I don't know, Matt Walsh might spread that kind of view. But that's not everyone who's concerned with it. And to lump everyone in this category is a silly and unintellectual. But I'll say at the core, how can one be a democratic socialist and assume that the fucking general public is just completely wrong about so many key issues? If you're democratic, you believe the majority should have a voice to some extent, right? You should believe the voice of the majority. If you're a socialist, you believe in the interests of, the many. How can you have that approach and not fucking trust people at all? Like have such a distrust of people to a point where, there's wrong completely on this issue. We just need to educate them. Because I'll say this, the general public is always right.
It's because they've been brainwashed by right-wing propaganda. That's their position. They believe that the masses have been brainwashed by right-wing propaganda that is made up out of thin air. They don't believe that right-wing propaganda works because it finds real things that people genuinely care about, and then it co-opts those things that people actually care about into its program. That's the
precisely supply and demand. It's like that with why are men turning right-wing? I saw like some left-wing influencers get interviewed on this question, and they're so clueless. It's incredible. They say,
I saw this.
Yeah, they say, oh, it's because they're watching Andrew Tate. They're watching Manosphere, Fresh and Fit. That's why they're turning right. Yeah, really? Every country in the world, every advanced democracy, men are turning right-wing. That's a structural problem. That's a deep material structural problem. What happened to materialist analysis? Why did that go out the window when it comes to these cultural issues, right? That is like a real analysis. And that's because, that's a really complex thing. I don't have all the answers to that thing, but I'll say there's one obvious reason, and you can just ask the people themselves as to why they're right wing. You can ask them, that helps. Polo, like sometimes I actually do believe in a value of polling. Sometimes like people will just say, well, one is like, I'm being men are being told that they're like, part of a patriarchal order, yet are actually doing worse than their female counterparts. That's a pretty big contradiction right there. And that's, you're going to get resentment between the sexes. And look, the real question isn't to say, I think Andrew Tate is making men whatever. The real question is how can people be so bitter that they're watching a fucking buffoon like Andrew Tate?
Right. Yeah, they want to act like he is this thing, and like he puts into their heads a certain set of negative thoughts or ideas or something. And it's like, no, there are objective crises and legitimate reasons for that resentment. And then there are people who prey on that resentment. Right. And so, but they can't separate they can't separate the preying on from like the objective circumstances that generate that resentment. And obviously, like you can get people who stoke the fires of that resentment, and I would say obviously he does do that. But no, if you've been told that you are the source of all the world's problems and that you have so much privilege, and you obviously aren't and don't, you're gonna feel resentful. And if you don't have a higher path towards other ways of thinking about it, and then this is what TikTok is showing you, of course you'll be susceptible to it.
They very well might implant bad ideas in their heads, but that's because the demand that occurred that caused them to watch them is because they're playing into something that organically arose due to material conditions, realities. In a thing on Substack that I'm gonna put out, I wrote it in a day, and a lot of my essays that are unpublished I write in a very short period of time. Well,
Nice.
it very well. Flow states, right? There's this thing I wrote called Prejudice, Hatred. It was prejudice versus hatred and the weaponization of hatred, which is that prejudice arises naturally. Prejudice is like literally just prejudgment. It's things that people experience and they develop kind of instant responses to. You could say it's their instincts. Prejudice is usually organic. No one creates, propagandists don't create prejudice. Prejudice arises organically. Hatred is when prejudice festers, and then people are given scapegoats for the prejudice or solutions, or it just festers because it's not dealt with, the contradiction. Weaponization of prejudice into hatred is, basically taking the immigration issue and saying, instead of talking about the structural immigration issue, saying, oh, look at all this particular group, Muslims, they're committing rapes or whatever. And then, festering hatred against the group, or, like Nazis and festering hatred against Jews. It's not new, right? But it's like, it would be wrong to be like, oh, everyone to say don't care about immigration, or to say men who have problems with feminism don't have a critique of it. Well, who also does? A lot of women do too. But
Right.
if you look at like what dominates mainstream feminism, I mean, of course, men are not going to identify with that shit. This is what Catherine Liu's been saying, and that's not just a matter of them being taught that by the ecosystem. That they already felt that. It's that the hatred festers when they feel unheard. It's like when, MLK said riots are the voices of the unheard. Well, yeah, it's a festering of that. And of course that can be weaponized, but what's your solution to the weaponization of prejudice into hatred? Is to not acknowledge the prejudice? No, it's to acknowledge the prejudice in a way that it doesn't lead to its weaponization into hatred. That's a solution, but no. The fucking left and liberals, as Christopher Lasch said, time and time again, the solution to big problems is to tell people to not think about them.
Right. And you should scapegoat and crucify the people who do speak to those concerns. That'll help. Tony, thank you for coming back. I got to
That was
bounce.
great.
This has been good.
Yes.
Yeah, man.
Oh,
Oh
yeah.
yeah. Thank you. Fuck yeah, dude. We did it.
You did it. That was
All right, I've got to go, and you probably have to get on with your day as well. If you're not going to, if you want to keep listening to stuff, then go check out the post-duopoly lecture that I did recently. It's more in this vein. But if you are interested in that sort of post-duopoly critique approach, we're going to have a really awesome reading group going throughout the year of 2026. Tony from One Dime will be a regular collaborator for that. And if you want access to special conversations, you will want to locally organize. Start a local reading group for the post-duopoly critical reading, or I think the proper term is de-radicalization starter pack. That's what it's called. The post-duopoly de-radicalization starter pack. I'll be talking about that more this weekend, but until then, the stuff behind me up here on the screen is all about the stuff happening at Theory Underground this year, the philosophy of stewardship and home economics, the philosophy of religion taught by Samuel Longcar, intro to theory, and as I was saying, we're going to have special guest lectures from Nick Land to Simon Critchley, as well as a whole bunch of other amazing professors who will be coming by, and I will be teaching Marx, Heidegger, Lacan, Levinas, Bourdieu, Baudrillard, Zizek, etc., etc., etc. And so I'm really excited about all of that, and yeah, hope to see you there. Become a member, and if you're a tier 2 or higher, remember you get to reclaim writing. You get to become a part of the writing workshop. And if you want extra one-on-one attention for a book writing or thesis kind of project, then you'll want to sign up at tier 3, because that's what that's all about. So thank you so much, and catch you on the flip side or whatever. Hey, comment though. Don't just click off of this. Like, click the like button. I mean, it literally makes a difference. If one person clicks the like button, 10 additional people see this in their feed. So you have an amazing power to pay it forward. And I hope you'll take advantage of that if you did enjoy this. Otherwise, just smash the downvote button. Okay? Thank you. Peace.